right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan Saylor with Great Plains Nature Center, and it is a beautiful Monday. I'm here to talk to you guys about something that's going on in the natural world right now, because this time, late March for Kansas, tends to be kind of the peak of spring migration. So I wanted to get into kind of the nitty-gritty about how birds manage to make such incredible journeys every year, and how they know where to go. All right, so let's talk first a little bit about what is migration, right? This is something we kind of take for granted, right? Birds, if they fly north when it gets warmer, they fly south when it gets colder. We've known that for a long time. So it's just kind of the general movement of organisms from one place to another for a specific reason. Now, birds obviously aren't the only animals that migrate. There are plenty of other migratory creatures out there, from monarch butterflies that fly all the way to Mexico every single year, or even whales and pronghorn and wildebeest and things like that that make great journeys through land and sea. The reason they do that, of course, is because mostly they need something, right? For a lot of the birds in North America, they rely on insects for their food source, or flower blooms, things like that, where they can find nectar. Once those food sources, which are kind of seasonal, right, start to dry up, they have to go somewhere else, or they just won't survive. So that's why the birds take off for the most part. Now, this is kind of cool. This is a photo from the birdcast. Okay, this is something that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology does, and what they're doing is they're actually using the radar from the National Weather Service to track the movement of birds. Because when migration happens, you've got billions and billions of birds moving across the globe all at once, right? So this is a capture from the migration map from last night at about 11:30, and you can see just how much movement is happening, right? Especially if you look right where Kansas is in the middle of that graphic, you can see that right through even over Wichita, we've got just massive amounts of birds flying in the middle of the night, right? A lot of them are nocturnal migrants, so we may not notice it during the day, but it's happening, and the amount of living things that are moving is pretty immense. I invite you guys to go check that out. That's a pretty cool website, actually. All right, so this is kind of a concept that'll come up a few times today, right? It's something called phenology, and this is kind of this can be kind of our word of the day, right? So phenology is basically the seasonal timing of different things in nature, okay? Or you can think of it also like nature's clock, right? There are certain things that happen in nature every single year that we can kind of almost, you could almost sort of set your watch to, right? When the leaves start changing, when the flowers start blooming, when the insects emerge, okay? These are all seasonal phenomena that are really closely linked to a specific time of year, and that plays a really big role in migration, right? For example, all those little things have to line up, right? If you think of things like hummingbirds and or our purple martins, which are starting to come back to the nest boxes after their long trip to Brazil over the winter. These, if they came back and we didn't have the insects out yet, or we didn't have food sources for them, all those birds would be in big trouble. So phenology, when these things sort of start happening year in and year out, plays a big role with bird migration. So we're going to talk a little bit next about how birds actually manage to make such a long journey. But before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about this guy. So even though migration seems kind of intuitive to us now, it's something that we've known, it's just something that you find out relatively early on. When you notice big groups of birds flying together, you ask, why is that? Oh, well, they're migrating. But that wasn't always the case, right? We didn't always have such a firm grasp on this idea of migration. And in fact, historically, there's been some pretty wild explanations for where birds go in the wintertime. Some people thought that they would dive into lakes and ponds and hibernate. They would go under the mud. Some people thought that they would fly to the moon. There were other hypotheses that they were just kind of dying off like the insects and then sort of bursting forth, kind of a spontaneous generation thing. So a lot of crazy ideas out there. But eventually, we got some clues, right, for where these birds are going and how they're doing it. And this is an interesting sort of case of one big clue that we got. So this is a bird that I call the Arrow Stork. And you can probably guess why by looking at it. It pretty obviously has something sticking out of it, right? So this bird was actually killed a long time ago in 1822. It was killed in Germany by a hunter. And the first thing the hunter noticed about it was that obviously it had somebody else already had taken a shot at it, right? And the bird was lucky enough to survive the first time with that arrow lodged in its neck. The origin of the arrow was pretty curious, though, because they eventually just figured out that even though this bird was killed in Germany, the arrow in its neck could be traced back to Central Africa. So obviously it took a huge journey over land and water to get from one place to the other. So this idea that the birds were actually moving from one place to another when the climate got bad or when the weather started changing was kind of started to be illuminated a little bit by things like the Arrow Stork. So, how do birds manage the journey, right? You could probably think of some ways in which birds are unique, right? Some ways in which they're a lot different than other living things. So we're going to sort of get into how does that actually help for a really long, sustained flight. Because some of these birds, some birds don't migrate very far at all. Some maybe only go a few hundred miles. But some birds take journeys that carry them across hemispheres, right? Some birds even go almost all the way from the North Pole to the South Pole during migration. So it can be a very long, very arduous journey. It can be sort of like running a marathon day in, day out for weeks at a time. So obviously the first thing you have to do if you're going to take on a migratory journey is bulk up a little bit. So birds have incredible flight muscles that help power their journey. If you look at a bird's anatomy, okay, one thing you notice right off the bat is that they have this interesting kind of fin coming off of their chest, right? That's called a keeled sternum. So on us, our sternum is right here in the middle. For birds, that actually protrudes way, way out, all right? That provides a good surface for these really big muscles to attach to. And if you look, okay, on that drawing, you can see that they have all of their flight muscles are concentrated in their chest, right? So when we move our arm up, we're using a mix of muscles, right, in our shoulder, in our chest, and when we move it down, we can feel some muscles in our back and our pectoral muscles starting to move, right? For birds, all of that motion is coming from up front in the chest. There's actually just a tiny little ligament that goes around through the shoulder and connects back to the chest. So when they flap their wings up and down, it's coming from the same part of the body. That's why when you go to the store, right, and you see chicken breast, okay, in the aisle, it's a really massive piece of muscle, okay? It's really lean too, because it's really, really, it's used quite a bit. You don't see things like chicken shoulder or chicken back, okay, in a store, because that's the biggest, meatiest part of the bird is coming from those flight muscles. And also, on that diagram of the chicken skeleton, you see that little V-shaped red bone there. I'm sure some of you probably know what that is because you have probably broken it at Thanksgiving time, right? That's called a wishbone, or the anatomical term for it would be a furcula, which is kind of a fun word to say. So the furcula actually helps to kind of brace the chest and stabilize it with those huge flight muscles, putting a lot of stress on the skeleton. But it also plays another important role that we'll talk about with breathing when we get to that in just a little bit. So birds also have to fuel up quite a bit for the journey. That's a red knot right there. And shorebirds are one of my favorite birds, and they're also that group, shorebirds in general, which includes red knots and plovers and all sorts of other things. They make some pretty crazy migratory journeys, thousands of miles every year. What's interesting about these birds and some of the other ones is that they will start increasing their food intake a lot, okay, by almost 50% before it's time to migrate, because they are putting on so much fat to the point where they're actually, by weight, about half fat, okay? They're putting on a lot of extra weight because they need all that extra energy for a migratory journey. What else is strange, though, is as they add on all that fat, some of these birds will actually start shrinking some of their other internal organs that they're not going to need while they're flying, right? Because many of them fly nonstop. And when you're flying nonstop, you're not stopping to eat or drink or anything like that. So things like your intestines, your stomach, your liver, you can actually shrink all that down, essentially let it almost kind of shrivel up and atrophy for a little bit. So it's as small as possible. Why is that important? If you think about it like a plane, right? When a plane is flying, they take this stuff into consideration too, okay? They're always thinking about how is the aircraft balanced, front to back, wing to wing. You want to have everything balanced as well as possible, so you're not being inefficient, right, or getting any extra drag or anything on the aircraft while it's flying. So they'll think of things like, okay, where are people sitting? How can we put them in the plane? Do we need to move them around a little bit so it's more balanced? How is the luggage, the cargo? Does that all need to be shifted around so it's just in the right spot? Everything on the inside of an airplane could potentially affect the balance. So when a bird is taking a long flight as well, they have to kind of move things around a little bit themselves, right? In order to be the most efficient and have only what they need to stay balanced and stay light while they're flying. All right, and obviously the wings, feathers, and bones of these birds play a really huge role. So many birds will molt right before migrating and get put on a whole new fresh set of feathers. So their old feathers, which might be beat up or what have you, aren't going to cause them any issues. Some birds like loons and geese will actually kind of molt all of their flight feathers. So those are the ones kind of at the along the wings, the ends of the wings, all at once. So they actually won't be able to fly for a certain period of time in the summer, which makes it kind of odd for them because they're just kind of swimming around and running around. They can't fly. But they'll do that all at once just to get it over with and not waste any, to waste as little time as possible where they're not able to get off the ground. So how do the feathers and wings of migratory birds differ from birds that don't migrate? Okay, this is an example here. So if we take a look at, let's take a look at like this great egret wing. Okay, you can see that it's got the wing, the feathers, the flight feathers right here. These are what they call the primaries. Those would be kind of like if you held out your arm, right? You'd have feathers off the edge of every bone, and the primaries would be kind of like the feathers that would be by your fingers. Okay, these are very long, very sharp, and kind of almost stiff feathers that form a really good continuous kind of surface, right? It's a lot like the wing of a plane, if you think about it that way. You've got it sort of structured so that air flows over it really well, and You get sort of lift on it as it's soaring. So that's kind of, that wing shape is really, really ideal for a long distance flight. Even the individual feather, if you look, this is a feather from a goose, it's very stiff, okay? It's still flexible, but it's very strong. You can see each little tiny hair or vein or hair of the feather is kind of zipped together, right? So you see birds preening a lot, kind of moving their beak through their feathers. That's what they're doing, is they're kind of zipping all these little hairs of the feather together so that they stay as a nice continuous surface. All right, you compare that with like a great horned owl feather. Okay, this is a bird that doesn't really migrate. It's a year-round resident here. You can see that their feathers aren't really designed for quick or aren't really designed for long distance flying, right? They're a lot more fringed. They're a little bit fluffier. Okay. Instead, these feathers are better for flying silently, right? So that they can catch their prey, because they don't really have the same need to move a great distance like a goose does. So that's a big one. And then obviously also the bones of these birds is very different. We're probably pretty well aware that bird bones are hollow, right? But they're not only hollow, they actually connect in part to the respiratory system of the bird. So these bones can fill with air, which helps with their flying ability. So it keeps them light and it helps keep them aloft. Now, bird breathing is probably one of the biggest contributors to their ability to migrate, right? Their respiratory system is very, very efficient. And it's a lot different than our own. So I put together a brief video to kind of help illustrate how that works, because it is a little confusing compared with how we breathe. So we'll see if this kind of helps illustrate a little bit. Okay, I hope that made sense. It's a lot more complicated when you compare it to how we breathe, but it makes their lungs way more efficient than ours. It's pretty fascinating how they're able to do that. Okay, and also, of course, we see, especially with geese, we see this a lot here, is birds synchronizing their flight. And not every bird migrates in a big group. Some birds migrate alone, all right? A lot of them do. But the birds that do kind of synchronize their flight, they will often get in a formation, right? We see the geese tend to fly in a big V, and that helps basically Each bird behind the leader kind of gets a little bit of extra lift from each wing beat in front of it, and each wing beat of the bird in front of it. So it kind of helps reduce a little bit of the effort that they have to put out in order to keep flying and stay aloft, because it is a very long trip. All right. So for me, this is the most fascinating part of migration, is how on earth do they know where they're going? Right? A lot of birds will go to the same places year after year. Some birds will even return to the exact same nest and the same tree every year. Okay, how do they manage to find these locations from hundreds or thousands of miles away? It's really fascinating to me. If you think about it, let's say you lost something. Let's say you went on a camping trip in Michigan last year, okay, and you left your favorite mug out at the campsite. You said, oh man, I really wish I could get back there and find it, but I don't know exactly how to get to where I was. Okay, how would you do it if you had to try and go and take this long trip to find something you lost 1,000 miles away? Well, let's think about that. Okay, you might you might use a map, right? That would be the obvious thing. Use a GPS. That's one of the best tools we have at our disposal. But say for some reason you couldn't find the exact spot, you might also use something like some landmarks. Okay, you might use a compass. There's a number of things you could use to help find your way. You could even use a little bit of your own memory to hopefully get some cues from things you recognize. So for birds, it's a little bit similar. Okay, the way that they navigate, the way that they orient themselves, they have a lot of tools, just like we would. Okay, to find these places over and over again, and some of them are pretty strange. All right, so we'll get into that here. Okay, so one big way that they go is that many birds will follow the same routes year after year. Okay. And this is good because some of the birds, they migrate based on sort of a genetic map, right? There are a lot of birds that will be born, and their parents will take off and migrate at the end of breeding season before the juveniles do. So after the juvenile birds have fledged, they kind of get left behind. But the juvenile birds still know how to get to the wintering grounds on their own, unassisted. So that's a big clue that there's some genetic component, there's some internalized map that they are following to get from point A to point B. And this is something that scientists, to be honest, don't quite understand fully, right? This is something they're still exploring and trying to understand how genetics, the role that plays in helping birds get around the world. But following the same route every year is helpful because juvenile birds migrating for the first time, they're a little bit bad at it, right? They don't always make the most efficient trip. So it takes them a few years to improve, right? So they've done studies where they track the flights of birds year over year, okay, with these kinds of transmitters to see how straight of a line are they flying in, and they find that they get better at finding their way. They learn the path a little bit better year after year, even though it's kind of an internal map. They do get better at migrating, so that line gets from point A to point B gets straighter and straighter the older they get. So flying the same route is very helpful. In that map, you can see those are kinds of super highways for birds, right? So we've got 4 major flyways in the United States. You've got the Pacific in red, you've got the Mississippi in blue, you've got the Atlantic in black, and you've got one of the big ones is the Central Flyway, right? That's the one that goes right over our heads. As you may or may not know, we get about 500 species of birds here in Kansas that migrate through in a given year. So, this is obviously really good habitat here in the Great Plains for a lot of these migratory birds. In some places, like Quivira and the Cheyenne Bottoms, okay, are really, really valuable wetlands. They're wetland, what they call wetlands of international importance, okay, because it's such a rich habitat for a lot of these birds as a stopover, Okay, so if you kind of think about when you plan a road trip, right, you want to take the route that's going to have a lot of the best stops. If you're, when you need rest, when you need food, and so forth. Birds kind of are on the same page. Okay, they are taking the route that's going to have the absolute best spots for them to stop and refuel before moving on. Just like you see those pelicans there at Cheyenne Bottoms. Okay, so even though some do have a genetic map, there are others still that have to be shown the way, okay? A whooping crane is a good example of this. Geese as well. They're born not really knowing where to go and rely on their parents to make that first migratory journey with them. So what you see in this picture is actually an ultralight aircraft. It's kind of like a hang glider attached to a fan. They're very small, very lightweight, and this is part of Operation Migration. So this is a group that worked with helping with the captive breeding and rearing of endangered whooping cranes, because there were so few of them at one point that there weren't enough of them around to help teach any new birds the migratory path. So what they would do is they would kind of acclimate these really young birds to the sounds of an aircraft from the time that they were chicks, and then they would actually lead them from Wisconsin all the way to Florida during the winter time to show them the path to how to get to these other cranes that would nest in these colonies down there. Once they have a sufficient number of cranes that were born and ready to go, they would take this long flight right alongside them. And it's pretty cool. You get some interesting video out of this. So this is one video from Operation Migration where you can see that there is a big number of cranes lining up off the edge of the plane. And you can kind of see as well, notice how they are synchronizing their wing beats a little bit, right? They flap a little bit, stop, kind of coast off the air that's moving off, not only off the wing of the plane, but off the wings of each other. It's pretty crazy. So, groups like this have played a huge part in trying to help an endangered species like the whooping crane start to come back in the United States. I think at one point there was only like 12 of them in the wild, and now there's several hundred. So that's a really cool thing. But yeah, they need a lot of help to sort of learn that migratory path. Now others are actually using some cues from the sky to help orient themselves. All right. European starlings are a common one that does this, that actually uses the position of the sun, not only to know when to start migrating every day, but also to get direction. Okay, they found that when starlings were kept inside, when they were studying this, that they would get very restless, very anxious if they didn't have a view of the sun. Okay, they wouldn't know which way to point, which direction to go. Other birds like indigo buntings actually use the stars, which is really fascinating. You see here you've got two birds side by side that are in what they call Emlen funnels, E-M-L-E-N, and that's named after the scientist who studied these. What he did is he would put these birds in these special funnels that would kind of record the movements that the birds were making, so they would be able to see which directions they were choosing, which directions they were deciding to go. And he would install these under planetariums in order to give them a view of the night sky, right? What he found is that these birds were essentially locating a fixed point in the night sky and using that to establish their direction, okay? The most obvious fixed point in the night sky is the North Star, right? So that's, if you were to look, okay, if you were to stay out all night, then you would be able to see the the skies seem to sort of almost rotate, right? The stars in the skies would almost sort of rotate around that fixed point because the axis of our Earth more or less points directly to the North Star. So it doesn't seem to move very much, whereas all the other stars would move in relation to it as the Earth turns. So you get that interesting, that if you were to stay up all night, that's a person who filmed it all night, kind of on a time lapse to show how the other stars were moving in the sky. So what's really crazy is that in those studies with the Imlin funnel, they would actually pick a different star to sort of rotate the sky around, and then the birds would then sort of learn what was going on in the planetarium. So they picked like Betelgeuse, right, which is one of the stars in the constellation Orion. They would rotate the whole sky around that star instead of the North Star, and found that the birds would eventually pick up on that as being the fixed point in the sky and change their direction accordingly. It's really strange to think about, but a lot of nocturnal migrants, okay, a lot of birds that fly by night are going to be using some of those cues from the stars to find their way. And of course, there are also birds with a built-in compass. So that there is a bobolink, and they are pretty well known for having a beak that kind of can point them in the right direction, right? So their beak contains a lot of what a mineral called magnetite, which helps them to kind of detect magnetic waves a little bit better. It's really strange because when they actually expose these birds to magnets, they found that sort of starts lighting up their visual cortex of their brain. So when these birds are around a strong magnetic impulse, something is happening with their vision at the same time. How exactly does that work? How exactly are they able to see or experience magnetic waves? We don't know. It's really difficult to try and figure out how another bird experiences how a bird experiences the world, or animals that have senses that are so much different than our own. But there's a strong indication that they are using both that beak and the magnetic waves of the Earth to kind of gauge direction by going to where the waves are the strongest, right? At the magnetic poles of the Earth. Like when you pull out a compass, the needle is always pointing to the magnetic pole of the Earth. That's where it's strongest. So it always points north. There are some birds that actually even smell their way home. So those are pigeons. Okay, those are domestically raised pigeons, but wild pigeons are like this as well. It's really, really bizarre. So they're known for also kind of having a similar sense for magnetism as well, right? They've done studies on how certain neurons, okay, on the nerves that connect their beak to their brain, what's called a trigeminal nerve. The neurons in that nerve actually contain a little bit of iron, okay, so they're sensitive to magnetism as well. But what's really strange is these birds are also kind of creating a map of odors while they migrate. So we've probably heard of homing pigeons before, right? You think of stories where where somebody maybe, in one castle would tie a note around the neck of a pigeon, release it, and then it would fly to whoever, the prince in the other castle, and then fly back, okay? The way that those pigeons are able to do that is using their nose more than anything. There was a study that compared the navigational abilities of birds with a severed trigeminal nerve, so that's the magnetism one, versus birds with a severed olfactory nerve. That's the one that you need to smell, okay? They found that the birds with the olfactory nerve cut weren't able to really find their way at all. Okay, so their sense of smell turned out to be more important than their ability to see magnetic waves. It's really strange to think about, but them finding their way home just based off the smells that they would encounter along the way. Maybe things like, the smells of certain trees, of certain flowers, of certain towns and cities. factories, sort of things like that, those may all play a role in helping these pigeons to kind of orient themselves and find the right way home. It's very fascinating, especially considering a lot of birds don't really have a very good sense of smell at all, and some of them have a sense of smell that's unbelievably delicate. Okay, so how do they know when it's time to go? A lot of factors affect a bird's decision to migrate, so this includes everything from light, okay? They kind of get a feel for when the days are getting shorter, and when the sun is setting earlier. That can be a big biological indicator. Obviously, the temperature, they can be sensitive to that as well, changes in the climate and the weather. Seasonal changes in the availability of resources would also be a big one as well. So all of these things, and genetics also, all play a role in sort of telling the bird that it's time to go. And this, I guess, leads me to my other word of the day, which is a fun one, and it's a German word, so it just rolls off the tongue. It's Zuggenruhe. And what that means is, and this is the actual term that scientists use for this, it means migratory restlessness. So Zuggenruhe is kind of the effect that we see when birds get really anxious by the days getting shorter, or the food going away, or what have you, temperature changes, things like that. That restlessness, that need to migrate, is something that you observe right before they do go. Okay, and so here's a possible issue, right? So if the birds are ready to go, but what happens if their timing is off? Okay, we talked a little bit about how young birds may not be as good at migrating as the adult birds are yet. They may not know the way quite as well. They have to learn it, so they might not show up at the right place on time. But what if none of the birds do? Right? And this kind of ties back in with that idea of phenology. Okay, so those seasonal changes, right? If the timing of those changes starts to get a little bit out of whack, it could have a really big effect on migration. If we think about forces like climate change, right? If it starts getting warmer in one region than another, then maybe the flowers start blooming earlier than expected. Maybe the flower blooms have fallen off before the birds that need them arrive. Okay, maybe they miss the insect emergence by a week. Okay, and now there's too much competition. All right, there's a lot of possible impacts of things like that, of the phenology changing, and not to mention just the temperature that they have at their wintering grounds. If it's higher, or even their breeding grounds as well, if that's higher, it could affect the success of their nesting too. It could actually affect the ranges of these birds. So there's a lot of issues with migration, right? We kind of have to have the whole planet, right? A lot of different habitats, a lot of different ecosystems have to be in good shape for these birds to make those migratory journeys and to thrive as species. Okay, so we'll just close out with by talking about a few of the migration superstars. These are some world record holders when it comes to migration. This is one of my favorite birds. This is the Arctic tern. Okay, and they are they're related to seagulls. If you don't know what terns are, they're kind of in that same family, but they look quite a bit different. They've got those long, sharp red bills and kind of a black cap. When they're flying, they're incredible. They're incredibly graceful. They're like fighter jets, with these, they've got these long forked tails. When they're on the ground and by their nest, they're very dorky looking, but that's part of the reason why I like them so much. They kind of waddle around a little bit. But this bird is amazing because it is a transpolar migrant. So that means they get 2 summers every year, right? They spend 1 summer up in the Arctic Circle, okay, when it's summer here, and then when it's summer in the southern hemisphere, they fly all the way to Antarctica. Okay, so they are at both extremes of the world, right? They fly about 70,000 miles a year to get to both places, which is insane to think about. The reason, why these birds are important to us is because they can kind of help us indicate the health of the marine ecosystems near the Arctic, right? They rely on that habitat up here for being able to lay eggs and breed as well. So if the Arctic isn't doing well, then the Arctic tern will probably not do well either. So they're kind of an indicator species for us as well. All right. The longest nonstop flight, that belongs to a bird with a great name. It's called a bar-tailed godwit. Okay, and this is a shorebird, just like the red knot we saw earlier. They make a very long journey of about 9,000 miles. There's one population that goes from Alaska to New Zealand, and they make it all in one go. Okay, so they start flying, and then 9 days later they land. It's really, really bizarre why they do it that way. I'm not entirely sure. It probably has something to do with the fact that it helps minimize the amount of time that they have to they invest in migration. Okay, so they can invest in other things like breeding and rearing chicks and things like that. What's also interesting is because of the fact that it is such a long nonstop flight, they will actually have to start digesting some of their muscle tissue, okay, as they're flying. So they're half fat, right, like all the shorebirds are when they migrate. So that helps fuel them, but they also have to avoid dehydration at a certain point. So they'll actually start breaking down muscle tissue for water. It's really, really unusual. It's hard to imagine any human equivalent of going that far, that fast with your own power. But it's kind of interesting to think about. If you took the same volume that they burn in fat, okay, to make that journey and turn that into an equal volume of gasoline, these birds would be getting something like 700,000 miles to the gallon. It's really, really impressive, really, really efficient. Okay, as far as highest elevation migration, the Barheaded Goose is at the top of that list. They're able to migrate across the Himalayas. So you have, and they migrate at a height of about 24,000 feet off the ground. Okay, so that's really, really high. If you think about Mount Everest, okay, it's 29,000 feet. These birds are almost that high off the ground when they're migrating. And that's where, again, those really efficient lungs make that possible. If you were to think about being a professional mountain climber and you're trying to, scale all the way up to the top of Mount Everest, it would be really challenging, right? You'd have to be in peak physical condition, and even then, as you get higher and higher, the air pressure gets lower and lower. You still wouldn't be able to do it without some form of oxygen, right? Some extra oxygen, like a mask or something, to help you make that journey, because our lungs just aren't suited for that. But you can imagine how frustrating it would be to be, almost all the way up to the top of this mountain and then just see geese fly past you full speed. Right, it would be kind of frustrating probably for the climber, but that's just the way their lungs are, right? We can't be mad at geese for that. They're much better at breathing than we are. All right, and this is an honorable mention because this is another one of my favorite birds. This is a Rufous Hummingbird. And a lot of hummingbirds are like this as well, but they make a migratory journey all by themselves. Okay, so they aren't flying in a big group. They're making a go of it on their own. And for this bird, that means flying from Alaska to Mexico and back. All right, so they're going all the way down the Pacific coast. If you know what hummingbirds are like, okay, they have a really, really high metabolism. They virtually can't stop eating throughout the course of their day unless they're sleeping. And their sleep, which is called torpor, is basically like them shutting their body all the way down, okay, and then rebooting and sort of restarting the bird program in the morning, okay. So they have to constantly be eating to satisfy that metabolism. So you can imagine how challenging that makes a long migratory journey. You have to have a lot of good places to find food, or you would be in real trouble. If a hummingbird was human-sized, okay, or if we had the same metabolism as a hummingbird, then we would need about 120,000 calories a day. Okay, so that's a lot. That means we'd have to be eating 60 times as much as we do now in order to satisfy that metabolic rate. So the hummingbirds are really interesting. It takes them a lot of energy to make that happen. All right, so lastly, what can we do? I know a lot of us we're inside, right? A lot of us are kind of cooped up a little bit with the quarantine that's going on. So, but there are still things you can do to help birds, right? Since this is peak migration time, you can help turn your backyard into a good stopover habitat, right? Be a good refueling station for a lot of these birds making that journey. Not only will you get some interesting visitors to your backyard, but it also makes a big difference for these birds that have a long way to go. The ruby-throated hummingbirds, as we get into April, they'll be coming through the state. Peak hummingbird time is kind of mid-April, so if you've got a hummingbird feeder, it might be a good time to clean it up, fill it up, and get that set up outside. And then just see what kinds of birds are in your neighborhood, what's coming through Wichita, what's stopping by. Could be a really interesting opportunity to see what kind of migrants you're getting at your home. All right, well, that's pretty much all I've got here. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll have daily naturalist talks coming to you from our page every day here this week. So, stay tuned, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.